to get to these answers of, was slavery a productive economic system? Was it responsible solely or mainly or in great portion for the economic growth and output of the United States? And so one of the ways that you can measure that type of question is through what's called GDP. GDP stands for gross domestic product. And when it says gross, it doesn't mean like it smells bad or something like that, or is yucky or something. Gross means like an overall. Before you start to say, look at things that reduce it, you say, okay, what overall in the United States, if we add everything up that has been produced of goods and services, what is the gross domestic product of the United States? Now, that's just one economic measure of an economic output. So it won't tell you everything. But basically, when someone produces corn and sells it, that's part of gross domestic product. Today, when somebody makes a shirt and sells it, that's gross domestic product. Okay, this all ties in. Gross domestic product is the goods and services produced from a particular economy over the course of a year. If we added all that up, the question is, and you can look at this year to year, is the United States producing more or less than the year before? Are we seeing areas of growth? Now, how do we apply this to slavery? Well, slavery was tied in with a few particular areas. I mean, it was tied in with lots of areas. There was a lot because economies are pretty complicated. However, slave labor itself was used in a few particular industries and a few particular agricultural crops, like cotton, tobacco, rice, different things of that nature. And the main one that we think of is cotton. Okay, so cotton, we can look at the cotton economy and how much was cotton part of the US economy during that time. Now, cotton was a big export and it did make a lot of money, and cotton is obviously used in lots of things like clothing and stuff like this, but it was often exported, meaning it was sold to other merchants and countries outside of the United States. So while the cotton economy for the people who were in it was very big, and it was also very intricately tied into things. For example, if you bought a shirt that had cotton in it, you were participating at some level in the cotton economy. But what would often happen is cotton would be sold outside of the United States. It would be bought up by these other countries, and then it would be brought back into the United States in manufacturers in usually northern areas, in factories and stuff, who would make products out of that cotton. And then they would sell it where they lived, but also sell it to farmers and people who produce the original cotton from where it was. This is called a division of labor, meaning different areas specialize in what they do best and then trade with one another in order to get the overall result of a product, like a shirt or something like that. So the question in regard to slavery and slavery being responsible for the overall wealth of the United States during that time, and even down to today, we can look at, well, how much was cotton part of the overall economy? Since cotton was one of those major industries that relied on slave labor, how much was cotton part of the US economy? Now, cotton was big in selling during this time, but cotton exports were only a small share of the national product, which is this bottom line down here. Okay. So there were cotton exports, merchants, so it was the trading of cotton and different stuff going on. But the cotton exports so it was a big part, cotton was a big part of US merchant exports, meaning it was something that was sold outside of the country, but it was not a big part of the overall gross domestic product. Meaning this, the area of the economy where slavery contributed the most was overall a very small part of the overall US economy. It was less than 5% before the Civil War. That's what's called the antebellum period, meaning before the Civil War, even when cotton was at its most successful, it was only about 5% of the overall US economy at most, which means that it was a very small percentage that slavery was and slave labor was only contributing over, when you look at the overall picture, a very small percentage of the overall economic output of the United States. But some people often make mistakes in how they count up gross domestic product. Now, in economics, there is a particular way that things are counted in gross domestic product. There's a method and a formula that you use. But it's easy for people who are not economists to make mistakes. They do something that to them makes sense, but will not yield them an accurate result. And one type of mistake is done by what's known as the cotton staple growth theory. That the theory is that since cotton is in so many other products, not just raw cotton as an export, that cotton was kind of the center of the growth of the overall American economy, whether slave states or free states. And then the claim is made that therefore the overall wealth of the United States rests on slavery and slave labor. So some historians claim that slavery was a net economic benefit to everyone except the slaves, meaning it made people in slave states rich, that all the wealth was totally built on the basis of slave labor. And because that slave labor that was used to produce those things was traded throughout the economy and different exports and things like this, that therefore slave labor was responsible for all of it or a great portion of it. But there are several mistakes made in this theory, even though it makes some sense on the surface. One of the mistakes made is the calculation of gross domestic product, or GDP. Okay? What gross domestic product is the value of all final goods and services produced by an economy. So you need to look at, when you count up GDP, you don't double count every time something happens. You look at the final goods and services. So you don't just look at the labor that was used to go into a shirt and the cotton that was used to go into a shirt and the nylon that was used to go into a shirt and all this stuff. You look at the final product and count that. Or you look at the final product of raw or refined cotton. But you don't say, okay, well, that shirt has cotton, so we count the shirt and we count the cotton. And you don't count every time that a transaction takes place. Because if you do that, if you double or count what are called transactional costs, meaning if you bought a shirt and then sold it to someone else, that doesn't count for GDP, because you're just counting the final product, the shirt. But if you do double and triple counting, you'll get an inaccurate number, meaning you'll get a number of GDP that is over 100%, which is logically and practically impossible. You can't have something greater than 100% in this calculation. So if you're counting up every single time a transaction takes place and then saying that that's GDP, that is not GDP. That's not the number, and it's an inaccurate result. Now, the point that cotton was used as raw cotton, refined cotton, and was in shirts and intertwined throughout the economy is true, but it does not give the result that the United States then or now was on the basis of slave labor. There's a quote here explaining this that kind of reviewed some of the thought behind this and corrected it in order to bring correction to this idea. So sometimes people write things and make mistakes in their methods when they write about history or they write about economics or they write about science or anything else. And sometimes people have to come behind and say, well, wait a second, here's a bunch of mistakes they made, which means that their conclusion is not right either. Here's a quote from an economist that talks about the history of the ending of slavery in America, but also just in the West in general. And he explains that it's because on the basis of economics, not just morals changing, not just injustice. That was a big part of the story, but it was because slavery no longer made sense as an economic system, because it was inefficient, unproductive, and more expensive than free labor. He said, the abolition of slavery and serfdom was a kind of European type of, a little bit of different type of slavery, says, is to be attributed neither to the teachings of theologians and moralists, nor to the weakness or generosity on the part of the masters. So he's saying, look, the end of slavery didn't come just because of religion or that people thought that slavery was immoral. And it didn't come because the masters or the slave holders were weak and decided to give it up, or that they decided to be generous and give it up. He says, look, none of those things explain the ending of slavery. He said, there were among the teachers of religions and ethics as many eloquent defenders of bondage as opponents. So look, he says, look, lots of people, philosophers, people in religions, a lot of them defended slavery, argued for slavery, and a lot of them talked against it. So what made the change? He said servile labor disappeared because it could not stand the competition of free labor. Its unprofitability sealed its doom in the market economy. Meaning, as things got freer, more productive, and there's more economic growth happening during the time of the 1800s, especially, you see free labor outcompeting slave labor. And free labor is cheaper, more productive, doesn't come with as many of the moral issues of slavery, and therefore slavery just couldn't compete any longer. Slavery ultimately could not compete with the efficiency and competition of free labor. And that's why slavery started to come to an end, where and when it did in this time in history. Now, there were other factors that were propping slavery up and that were keeping slavery going maybe longer than it otherwise would have. We can't know what would have happened. However, there were things like slave patrols. most people did not own slaves. Only a few people owned slaves. Only very few within that number owned a lot of slaves. Most people who owned slaves in the South during this time before the Civil War owned less than 5, usually maybe 2, and you'd have to be pretty wealthy to own or rent slaves. It's only the very, very few of the wealthy planter elite that had 200 slaves or some numbers like that. So it was very unusual. So most people in the South did not own slaves. They were poor yeoman farmers. Now, that didn't mean they were against slavery in principle, because they were existing in a slave society. And it didn't mean that they believed that slaves were equal to them in terms of human dignity and rights. However, how do you have a system where only a very few own slaves, most don't? How do you get the people who don't own slaves to prop up that system? Well, it could only be done through force, through the government. The government of these states established slave patrols that required people, white men who did not own slaves, to help enforce slavery. So rather than the people who actually have slaves taking on all the enforcement costs to make sure that slaves didn't run away, didn't fight with them, actually worked under coercion and all this stuff, that costs a lot of time and energy and money and resources to keep that system going. So what happened was the people who owned slaves worked hand in hand with the government of the states to basically require the non-slaveholding white men to take on the costs of enforcing slavery. So basically, the wealthy planter elite got the government to place a big tax on non-slaveholders. Now, it wasn't a tax of money, it was a tax of making them go on slave patrols and enforced slavery. So the increased costs of slavery continued to go up because there was the risk that slaves would run away, that they would fight, that they wouldn't get work done. And therefore, you have to have an enforcement of the system that becomes very costly. Now, under normal circumstances, the cost of keeping slavery going would start to outweigh the benefit of using slave labor in the first place, which would mean that slavery would fall apart. But if you can shift the expenses and externalize the cost of slaveholding onto other people and basically make them enforce and pay for the system to keep it going artificially, that's a way that slavery can be continued. That most people who don't have slaves are basically paying in time and energy and resources so that the wealthy planter elite working with the government can continue to have slaves. Now, what if you were a white man and you didn't have slaves and you didn't want to do this and you said no? Well, then you're risking being fined, being imprisoned, being punished by the government. So you were being forced and coerced to enforce a system from which you got no benefit. This system also reinforced a class distinction between people, that even if you were poor owned no slaves, but were white, you were seen as, well, at least you're a white freeman. So that continued the system along as well. These were established in every state. They also enforced what were called black codes that did not allow people to meet in certain times. It didn't allow them to carry certain weapons. Sometimes it didn't even allow them to have dogs, sticks, canes, guns as weapons. That the slave patrols that you would be forced if you participated in this, which you would be required to based on the law if you were a white male living in these states, that you would have to enforce black codes or laws of the state against blacks. You'd have to chase down and apprehend runaways. You'd have to monitor pass requirements for people who were leaving between plantations, slaves that were moving between plantations. You'd have to break up large gatherings, and you'd have to suppress insurrections. So, along with chattel slavery, the kidnapping and the forced labor of people in slavery, there's also slave patrols that are forcing people by their own state government to take on the costs of slavery from which they're getting no benefit. And these slave patrols were hugely important. This pro-slavery theorist named George Fitzhugh, from the time he was well known back in this time, he said that the slave system could not work without slave patrollers. Basically, that slavery would be very vulnerable and would fall apart, and the costs would outweigh the benefits of slavery if you did not have the government requiring non-slave holders to enforce slavery. He said the poor he's talking about the poor white people who don't own slaves but are required by the government to enforce the system. He says the poor constitute our militia and police. They protect men in possession of property, as in other countries, and do much more. They secure men in possession of a kind of property, slaves, which they could not hold a day but for the supervision and protection of the poor. So basically he's admitting, look, if we didn't have these slave patrols, slavery would be so costly that the whole system would break down. So people were being forced to participate in this within the states as well. It was said that slave owners created a police state that benefited a small elite, meaning a few people at the top, at the expense of blacks and poor whites. In other words, blacks were being enslaved, but also poor whites were being forced to enforce slavery, both by their government. So the slave patrol created a tax. It shifted enforcement costs to small slaveholders and white non-slaveholders. Now, last thing we'll finish out here is, okay, we can do a comparison to see. So we see that slavery is not economically productive, that it did not contribute overall to the GDP of the United States ever more than 5%, that it was during its own time more expensive than free labor, that it required a system in each state to artificially prop up slavery so that it could continue to survive by shifting all the enforcement costs onto people who did not have slaves for the benefit of people who did have slaves. And so we see that slavery could not stand competition with free labor. But there's one last thing to think about here as we finish off with the economics of slavery, is we can do a comparison before the Civil War and after the Civil War in a major product that was originally the biggest product industry in slave labor, and that is cotton. We can look at how much cotton was produced and sold when there was slavery in the United States versus when there was not slavery in the United States. Now, former slaves and blacks in America were still going to continue to struggle and, have unfair practices done against them, business deals and stuff that was exploitative in many cases. And that was still going to happen. But it undermines the seriousness of slavery to say that, well, slavery basically just continued like it had always been. No, slavery came to an end. Now, there's still going to be a struggle. There's still going to be a time period where that promise was going to have to be made a reality in many ways. However, we can look at the difference between a slave economy and a free economy, meaning non-slave did not produce what it produced on slave labor. And we can see which one produced more cotton. So in the 1850s, cotton was the big industry. They said cotton is king, and it was mainly produced, if not exclusively produced, by slave labor in the 1850s. Civil War takes place. Slavery comes to an end. Now, a few years after the Civil War is 1861 to 1865, 5 years after the Civil War, slavery no longer exists. 1870, how was America doing after fighting a hugely expensive war, $6.6 billion? How was it doing in producing cotton? Did it produce less, the same, or more cotton than when it had a slave economy? And the answer is, in 1870, cotton production approached peak pre-war levels. In other words, 5 years after this major war in the United States, and when there is no more slavery, cotton is already back to the highest point it was before the Civil War when there was slavery. In other words, 1870 cotton levels show us that cotton being produced without slave labor could be at least as productive without slave labor, or at least as productive as it had been with slave labor. In other words, slavery was not necessary to produce the same amount of cotton. Even more, 1891, 21 years later, cotton production was twice the level of peak pre-war production. In other words, 20 years after that, with a free economy with no slavery, the United States produced more cotton, double the amount of cotton than it had ever produced with slavery. Therefore, slavery, we can intuit from this, is not productive, but actually held back production in the United States, held back economic output. After slavery, the United States produced more cotton than it ever had before with slavery. And therefore, it doesn't make economic sense to say that all the wealth and production and things of the last 200 years and of the modern United States is all based on slave labor. In fact, the evidence points to the opposite, that slave labor was actually producing some things for a very small elite at the expense of everyone else, but it was generally holding back the US economy, which is a good thing to know, because that means that slavery, that if you not only do the right thing and bring it to an end because of a matter of justice, it also has benefits in that it's not productive to have slavery anyway.